And welcome to EduCurious. We're going to get started with a very special guest, Ebo Entsuah. I know him from grad school, but I've got lots of questions because he is sort of a celebrity in our world. He played Florida State football and politics in Tallahassee. I've got lots of questions for you. Thanks for being on the show, first of all.
Thank you, Amber. I appreciate it. And honestly, I wanted to give you props because a lot of people don't get the name right on the first try. So good job.
Oh, tell me a little bit about yourself. First of all, your name speaks that there's probably a story behind it. If you want to kick off with that, and then just jump into your educational journey.
Yeah, of course. So to get to my name and kind of the story and whatnot, you're going to have to go very, very far back. My parents are immigrants from West Africa and they immigrated to the United States. I went from Ghana, where they were born and raised, to Canada, and then from Canada to the United States. And essentially, in Ghanaian culture, children are given a what we call a day name. So depending on what day you're born, and depending on if you're a boy or a girl, you may have a different variation of a name or something along those lines. So for my name is Ebo, and that means boy born on Tuesday. Yes, I was born on a Tuesday. Um, and it's not necessarily like I have a lot of friends who are like, oh, does that mean there's a bunch of like Ebos running around? And it's like it's not necessarily like that. There are, like I said, different variations. So while my name might be Ebo, it could also be like Kwame or something else of the sort like that. So there may be different variations, or some other folks may have like middle names that are very similar, but I'd say it definitely is a more common name in Ghana than it is here in the States. So that's kind of the history behind the name. And just in terms of my like educational journey of where I am, you'll probably hear me talking about it a lot, especially in terms of like my parents. For them, education was the biggest, if not the only thing aside from our faith. It was one of those things where they told us, hey, you're never going to be given anything and you're going to have to work for everything. So through them, they kind of really instilled on myself and my two sisters that, hey, education is the first and only thing aside from your faith, and you're going to have to work as hard as possible to get to where you want to be. And we saw that from them. My mom is a family physician and my dad is a civil engineer, and they're just now retiring mainly just because they love to work. So it's one of those things where we always had great models growing up, and I always knew I wanted to go as far as I can and with my education and get to that point. But for me, the biggest journey was kind of how to get there itself. Funny enough, like you said, and like you can see behind, I did go to Florida State and I did play football there. But even while I was playing football, education was still in the back of my head and trying to figure out what I wanted to do after, because although I was, talented at the high school level and okay at the college level, it was one of those things where I'm not 6'6", I'm 5'11" and 3/4, on a good day. And I might not have been blessed with the best physical genes, but it was one of those things where I knew I would have to do something after my playing time was over and when I would have to transition. So I was able to essentially, I came in wanting to be pre-med and I left FSU with a international affairs and sociology degrees. I don't regret not changing, but it was one of those things where I obviously college was one of those times where I definitely had to find myself, like we say, in order to kind of get to our next destination on our journey. So after I graduated, I moved to Washington, D.C. And then in D.C., I worked on Capitol Hill for a number of years for a number of representatives and learned a ton about just the political process at a federal level that I originally wasn't really interested in at all. But after a while, I kind of learned that I really enjoyed it. And I actually enjoyed the personal connection you had to have with people in order to not just get ahead, but in order to get things done. And I had to make a decision and say, hey, do I want to stay up here? Do I want to work for another office or go into the private sector? Or, do I want to make my own path and do something myself? So I took a leap of faith, a very large leap, and decided to come back home to Central Florida where my family lives and run for office myself. And, this is me being a 26-year-old kid, just a couple years out of college, didn't really know anything, aside from, my lefts or my rights. and I came back home and I jumped straight into it. After a while, I finally got elected. I think it was two times, two and a half times technically, and I became the youngest ever elected official in the city of Claremont, where I'm from. So it was one of those things where I honestly just decided to jump in and kind of see what happens. That's a lot of the advice I tell a lot of folks. I'm like, hey, you can prepare for things as much as you want, but at the end of the day, if you're not going to go out there and do it, you're kind of wasting everybody's time. So after I got elected, I was working at the same time. I was working at a college preparatory school as a teacher, and I knew I loved education. I mean, I worked on education policy on the Hill, and I just loved academia in general. And at that time, I had gotten my master's too. I found out very quickly that I did not like teaching, but I liked education. And then that's when I decided, I wanted to go back to education policy and higher education is kind of the realm that I wanted to kind of take. So got a new position in my current one now, and I'm now the director of government affairs for a K through 12 STEM education nonprofit called Project Lead the Way, and they do curriculum for all types of schools through all 50 states. And I'm really, really enjoying my time here now, and that's why I wanted to learn more about higher education administration and just leadership in general. So it's been a fun ride. And I know I kind of gave you the really, really long version, but that's kind of how we got to where we are now.
I love that you gave me the long version because that launches all these questions. And one is, what kind of control do we have within a school system in the political world? How do we actually make big changes? Where would we start? What's your advice to making the changes outside just our district?
There's a reason why I wanted to start local, and there's a reason why, unfortunately, there's a stigma when it comes to local politics that people think it's just, getting my potholes covered or getting my trash taken out on time. But it's a lot more than that. Honestly, you look at property taxes, you look at penny sales taxes. A lot of those are done at the local level, and a lot of the money and funding that comes from those taxes actually helps with schools and your school district as well. If you really do want to get involved, there's two levels that you really should look at. One is obviously the school board, which is the big one that everybody knows. But at the same time, looking at your city council or even at your planning and zoning commission, those are two other ones that are very, very important that a lot of people have not thought about in terms of getting involved. It's not just the boring minutia of potholes, but it's also, hey, my property tax values are going up. Is this because we have new schools coming in, or is this because our population is getting bigger? So I always tell folks, like, if you really want to get involved with politics, obviously Congress is great, and even your state legislature is great as well. But the local one is the really one that matters because the decisions that are made there are the ones that are actually going to affect you, your neighbors, and the people in your classroom as well. So definitely the local one is what I will always, 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 always point to folks who want to get involved in any type of political process.
So just going in our own backyard is where we can make change, where we see and feel.
Yes, it is. And I think that also helps that since it is so close to the people, your voice matters even more. It's one of those things where because these are your neighbors and people, the districts are usually a lot smaller in comparison to state and federal ones. In the city of Claremont, you have a city of about 50,000. And for that, you have about 5 council members as well as some staff. So it's one of those things where you have the ability to reach out to them personally just because your district is a lot smaller. And obviously it's different for other states that are smaller comparison to Florida. But this gives you the opportunity to actually step up and say, hey, I saw that vote you made last week. I'm not sure it was a good vote. This is probably the way I would have voted, obviously in a respectful way. But a lot of people don't realize that people will listen. Even if you guys don't agree, they will listen to you for the most part. Obviously, have your outliers, but that's the way that it's supposed to go.
So if I'm watching this and I have never given local politics or school board a thought, but I want to get involved, what do you recommend as step one?
Honestly, there are two big things I would say is just one, do a tiny bit of research in terms of just looking at who's on your board, looking at what type of boards. And then two, honestly, I would say is just show up to everything. That was the biggest thing. Even when I ran for office the first time, I went to everything. I went to every planning and zoning meeting. I went to every code enforcement meeting. I went to every city council meeting, and I just asked questions. At first, a lot of people kind of like brushed it off like, oh, who's this young kid here just asking questions or, trying to figure out what's going on. But for me, it really was one of those things where I wanted to know, why are we making this decision? When was this decision made? Why did the council vote this way last time? What are the ramifications of the decisions we made in the past? And what are we thinking for the future? What is that strategic plan for the future? So that's one of the things that I first did was I did research. Funny enough, another reason why I ran for office in the first place was as a 26, 27-year-old who was working on Capitol Hill, who obviously knew like staffers on that level and people around, I got to know some of those folks. I wanted to do the same thing at the city and county level. So I reached out to every single member of my city council and every single member of my county commission at the time. So this was about 12 folks, and only two of them got back to me. Um, and I wasn't, asking any burning questions. I literally was like, hi, like I grew up here. I want to know what you do. Tell me what you do. And for only two of them to actually reach out and be like, hey, like, let's sit down, let's get coffee next time you're in town. I was like, you know what? You're supposed to be representing me, and you can't even take the time to reach out to somebody young who's asking questions and saying, hey, what are you like, what's going on? It kind of pissed me off. So it was one of those things where I decided, you know what, I'm not going to be that person. If I ever was to get elected, I was going to be as transparent as possible and have an open line of communication. So those are the things that I decided to do. I said, you know what, I'm going to look at research. I'm going to see who's on these boards. I'm going to see how long they've been there. I'm going to see what they actually do, and not what they say they do. And I wanted to come in there and make a change that needed to happen.
So, how often do you make time to sit down with some of the young leaders?
I try to keep a really, really open line of communication just in terms of my mentees and kind of just folks who do want to get involved. And I've had a number of folks throughout the years reach out to me and kind of just say, I saw like your story and I saw you on like a news hit and I kind of just want to know like more about what you're doing and kind of like how it worked out. And I will always take the opportunity to sit down with somebody and actually get to them and get to know them a little bit just to talk to them because it's so important. I had the privilege of having good mentors. Not all of them were in politics. A lot of them were outside of it, which actually was a bit of a positive for me. But I found that and a lot of times, if we're not imparting any of the knowledge or even just any of the things that we're seeing on folks younger than us, they may miss out on things that we could have prevented. And I know that happened to me a couple times where after I spoke with some folks, I was like, man, I wish I would have learned that a year before making this vote or a year before talking about this. So I will always, always, always make sure I can reach out with mentees and kind of just have them pick my brain or even me pick their brain just to kind of ask them questions and point back in terms of, why do you think that this is a good idea if this is something that you want to do? Because I've always found, and I think even you understand now with our program, some people are meant to poke holes in your theories and meant to poke holes in the things that you believe to make you think a little harder.
But how do you feel that football, being on a team, a very high caliber team, relates to being on politics and being on the stage for people to do just that, poke holes at you?
Yeah.
Give me some correlations.
Yeah, honestly, it's shaped everything I've done. Just one, I tell everybody, even for your kids growing up, I really, really highly encourage them to do some type of organized team sport. It's one of the things where I learned perseverance and I also learned cooperation. And I also learned that we're not always going to agree on things, but at the end of the day, we want the same thing. And it's just about the way to get there. There have been plenty of times and plenty of instances on the field or in the practice field or even in the locker rooms. You have an argument with somebody, you think they're not doing the right thing, you step up to them, and then after you look back and you say, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I see now why coach did this, or I see now why we were running this drill instead of running a different one. And you can come back to them and say, hey, I was wrong. I understand it. I appreciate you calling me out on it. There's not enough humility these days when it comes to politics. People are not able to say when they're wrong, and if they are, they kind of just brush it off to the side. So I think there's a one-to-one correlation just in terms of politics and education in general of being able to work as a team and say, hey, we all want the same thing for our students. We want the same thing for our residents. We want the same things for our constituents. We want everybody to win. That's really the long and short of it. But too many people these days only think about themselves, and only kind of make decisions that they feel like would affect them instead of the people around them.
And you said that your family is originally from Ghana.
Yes.
and your family came over here. You grew up in Claremont. Tell me why it's such a positive thing when we have people that come to our community from different places with different perspectives. It's not something that we need to be like, we need to listen and also extend the opportunity to collaborate and learn from each other.
Yeah, I mean, we say it all the time, the United States is a melting pot. It's one of those things where all we have a base that we've started out with, and then adding all of those different seasonings, adding all of those different ingredients turns out to make a bigger and even more delicious meal, essentially. I've always been somebody who says, hey, if you're coming here, obviously you respect the rules of this place, but if you want to add a little flavor to it yourself, please do, as long as it's not detrimental to the folks around you or to other people or yourself, by all means, take your seasonings, take your salt and throw it in there and give it a little stir. But too many times these days, I'm not sure if it's on one side or the other. Some folks seem to think that any type of different add-ons can ruin the stew that's brewing. So it's one of those things where you have to be open to things, but also understanding. It's about being open to things, but also realizing, seeing where you came from and seeing what we began with and continuing to honor that while adding new things in at the same time.
And what are some of those foundational elements, sort of your guiding compass? You mentioned family and faith. What are your core values that also keep you aligned and respectful and responsive and proactive?
We all come from different aspects of different walks of life, but at the end of the day, we are human. So people will make mistakes. People will falter from the road that they want to travel. But at the end of the day, it's all about one, having your freedom, your individual freedom and liberties, but two, making sure that you're being respectful to the person next to you and making sure that, they're on their own journey as well and understanding that, not everybody's journey looks the same. You understand it. Not everybody comes from the same spot. Not everybody's learned the same things, and having to be respectful of that, but also being able to respect yourself is key in my opinion. I will never disparage somebody for any type of decisions they make. I may not agree with it, but I'm not going to say, because you are X, you're Y, or because you are X, you're wrong. I will listen to them, I'll hear them out, and then we can have a civil discourse or civil discussion. And hell, we may even come to an agreement after everything, but you just, you never know until you actually open up and talk to somebody and try to have respectful discourse with them.
Who are some of the mentors that shaped your life? And could be teachers, it could be professors, or maybe coaches that really gave you some insight and direction.
Yeah. I've had a couple. The biggest one obviously are my parents. They're obviously, everybody, that's the de facto answer for, I guess, maybe 75% of the community. But I'd say my parents, they've instilled a lot of um, knowledge and wisdom into to me, and kind of, a lot of the things that I see with them, I try to emulate in my everyday life. One of my first coaches in high school, Coach Bud O'Hara, was definitely a pivotal mental mentor in my life. He instilled a lot of faith in me as well. Took a chance on me when a lot of other folks didn't, and it showed. And it's nice to be used as a model of what actually works if you listen to somebody, even though you don't agree with them all the time. Another person I would say is one of my former teachers, Dr. Alex Nessick from FSU. She was my global conflict and resolution professor, and she was a straight shooter. She told you what she thought, and she always was. If you're combative to her, she'll be combative right back. But at the end of the day, you knew it was because she understood, and she wanted the best for you. I've been very, very lucky and blessed to have good mentors and people that I can rely on when the going gets tough.
So at this point in your career, you're staying busy with your job, director of government affairs and curriculum. Do you have any insight on the direction that curriculum in particular as a nation is going with the new kind of like fearful component of AI and all of those technologies?
Yeah, for us, it's been interesting just because our institution has always been trying to be on the side of proactivity and not reactivity. So for us, it's always been, if these new technologies are coming up, what can we do to one, take advantage of it, and two, make sure that people know, hey, if this, this new technology is coming, which we know it is coming, it's already come and it's already been used. What can we do to actually make sure that folks realize that this isn't something you need to be all doom and gloom about, but you do need to understand and realize that it's here. It's not going anywhere. In fact, it's getting bigger and bigger every day. That's been one of the biggest things that we've tried to do is just educate. And we actually have curriculum now on artificial intelligence because we realized, hey, this is something that's going to be huge. This is something that we are going to see everywhere, whether it's schools, whether it's grocery stores. I wouldn't be surprised if you see it in government to an extent soon. It's one of those things where it's not going anywhere. I don't know. I don't believe it's going to be like Skynet or like Terminator, but it is one of those things where you do have to have an understanding that it's here. You can try and be as fearful of it as possible, but that's not going to help anybody. It's definitely not going to help us in our day-to-day life.
And you have often in the course of your life, it sounded like you stop and you ask why. You ask why there's policies in place. And in this case, you're asking why is there fear around AI? And then coming up with answers to help mitigate it or to prepare, like to educate people for that.
Yes, 100%. And I mean, we've seen, especially at the state and federal level, there are some lawmakers who are absolutely terrified of it. And they let this fear essentially guide how they legislate. We've seen some pieces of legislation in some states where they want to totally get rid of AI permanently in the classrooms when we know for a fact that students are still going to be able to access it, whether it's on their phones, whether it's in their computers. They'll be able to. We know how it is. You know how it is to be a teenager again. If somebody tells you no, you're going to find a way to find a way. So it's one of those things where you need to be able to educate them and say, hey, there are ways we can mitigate this. There are ways where we can get around this and make sure that, hey, we can have this policy in place, but you may need to have some tweaks in it in order to make sure that, you're not trying to make sweeping changes because you and I both know the road to hell is paved in good intent with good intentions. So it's one of those things where we see that a lot when it comes to legislation, and you have a lot of consequences just because people thought this was going to be a good piece of policy.
What do you have coming down the next, I don't know, what are your goals in the next 5 years? Where do you see yourself?
Yeah, so I've got sweeping goals, I guess you could say. It's kind of funny. My wife is always like, "I love it. You're just planning and you're gonna do what you do and that's it." And I'm like, "Yeah, I hope so." So in the next 5 years, you might laugh, but in the next 5 years, I would love to be a university president at that point. And kind of just trying to make good reform and good changes in the higher education space. For too long, I think we've essentially not looked at the root of a lot of problems in terms of one, student retention, but also in terms of teacher retention as well. So it's one of those things where I really believe we need higher education reform. And, originally I wanted to kind of go to the politics route to see if I could fix that. But at the same time, I realized that fixing your own backyard is going to be one step in order to fix the nation. So that is, I'd say my goal is to become a university president. And I think in the next 5 years, I would love to have that and attain that.
To dive in a little bit about the student and teacher retention, what do you think we can do to change that? Is it going to be being more flexible with work hours, with location, with diversity? What are your thoughts of where we need to be headed?
Yeah, and this is obviously the crux of the problem for a lot of folks. What are we supposed to do? Like obviously the big draw would be pay our teachers, but I do also think with that, we need to create more incentives for wanting people to stay. Because one of the things that we see, especially these days in a lot of different schools, is you see new teacher bonuses and you understand it. If you want to bring in new talent, you want new retention, you want new folks to come in, you have, those bonuses and pay structures that are aimed to them to make sure that they come in and they can actually, want to start. But at the same time, we have 10-year, 20-year teachers who are now essentially making the same thing as them. I do think that having some type of incentives to allow teachers to want to stay, get better, and actually make sure that they can show the students that they have learned just as well as the students are learning in order to benefit both of them. So I do think that is one thing, and it's the biggest thing I think most people would say is teacher pay and student retention. But I think flexibility with students is always a good thing, allowing them to make their own decisions, but also allowing for some type of structure is going to be key because for far too long, I think students either feel like they've been too rigorously mandated, and that's kind of thrown people off themselves. So allowing for students to have their own autonomy is going to be paramount. There's actually a book by a scholar Ian Rowe called Autonomy, and it basically talks about, allowing students in the K through 12 space. And I think it also translates to the collegiate space to allow themselves to have their own autonomy and make decisions for themselves and not feel like they're being put in one direction or, shepherded into another one.
What did you not like about teaching?
There were a lot of rules that kind of held me back and I felt like I needed to experience it before feeling whether I, thought this was something I could go on doing for a very long time. And it wasn't. I just felt like I was kind of being held back a little bit. Teaching students is the same thing as talking to politicians. They're literally the same thing, just one wears a suit and the other wears a uniform. So I always enjoyed that.
But instead of just saying, oh, no, you're like, well, you know what I can do is make that whole system better. Has your perception of just career goals or thoughts about life changed? You recently had a new addition to your family. How does that translate?
If you would have asked me 4 or 5 years ago, what do you want to do and what do you want to, where do you see yourself? I would have been like, oh, you want to be elected to this highest office and kind of just hang out, but not be like a president or governor or anything like that, because that's a lot of work. And now it's kind of like whatever I can do to provide for my family is ideal. I think one of the biggest things for me is I want to keep doing this until I feel like I'm not making a change anymore and then I want to stop. So for me, I do still want to make a change, but obviously I would like to live at least a little comfortably. And I think that's kind of how it's pivoted for me a bit more now that I have my daughter and she turns a year in 2 weeks. It's one of those things where I want to give them a life where they feel comfortable and supported, but also, want to make a positive change in my community and my area around me, wherever I am.
The why sometimes changes the direction, but in this case, it just gives you more fuel to the fire. So if you could go back to when you were like, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, what advice would you give yourself at that age?
At that age, I would probably tell myself to have a bit more confidence in myself. Growing up, I was definitely very self-conscious just in general. There was a lot of self-doubt, a lot of, am I going to live up to expectations? Whether it was my parents' or my sisters, everybody in my family is very successful. And then obviously, you have your physical self-esteem issues and whatnot. And you get it. You haven't necessarily found yourself, especially in that age. So it was one of those things for me where like, if I were to go back and be like, hey, have confidence in yourself, go 100%, even if you mess up, the fact that you did it 100% is key. And I was taught that. I was taught that towards the end of my teen years is, I want you to go 100% no matter what. And even if you mess up, the fact that you did it full-heartedly or wholeheartedly is learning experience for you. Um, so that would be the big thing is, hey, love yourself, be fully confident in yourself. Even if you make a mistake, you keep going and you learn from that mistake. And your perseverance is what's going to help you progress would definitely be it.
Besides being the youngest politician elected in Claremont and a Florida State football player, what are some of your greatest accomplishments?
I would say two things I would say is one being a father has probably been, in my opinion, my greatest accomplishment and actually being present for my family. The other one is one of the first things I did when I got elected was we instituted a internship apprenticeship program for the city. COVID obviously knocked it out a little bit, but it was one of those things where, this was an opportunity to have a youth council and allow for folks to come on who were in high school and kind of learn more about the different aspects and different departments at your city government and kind of how those work. So it was one of those things where I learned a ton from, but I also had a cohort of kids who they learned a ton as well. And it's nice to see them do well on that. So I would say it's those two big things, aside from obviously sports and everything else.
Any words of advice before we end the episode? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest one is I try to tell folks, and I don't know if you can tell just from the time we've spent together, either today or just in our groups, is, hey, I try to be a optimist. And my dad used to tell me all the time, your attitude determines your altitude. So it's one of those things where I try to attack everything, even if it's a bad issue. I try to attack it with as much optimism as possible, and not just blind optimism, obviously being realistic. But it's one of those things where, if you have a crappy attitude about something, it doesn't make it any better. So 100%, take a deep breath, think about the positives, and try to attack whatever situation or whatever problem you got going on, um, one thing at a time. Like I said, your attitude determines your altitude. And it's one of those things where if you want to keep climbing higher, you can't do it with a crappy attitude.
Well, Ebo, thank you for spending the morning with me. I know your life is super busy, but like you said, you make time for people because relationships are a priority. And I wish you best of luck. You don't really need luck. I wish you the best on your journey. It's always a pleasure. So thank you. And that brings us to the end of our episode. So whether you're a teacher, a parent, or just EduCurious, join the community as we explore various educational topics and learn from each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amber.